The dust hung thick in the slanting light that filtered through the pines, each mote suspended like a grain of doubt. Tokala sat on a weathered log outside the cabin, his buckskin tunic dark with travel sweat, the fringe along his sleeves motionless in the still air. His war bonnet rested across his knees, eagle feathers catching the amber glow. He kept the eagle feather war bonnet folded and safe. He didn't wear it for daily work. He had not expected visitors yet. Here they stood, a woman and a boy, both barefoot, both too thin. Grace's homespun frock had been gray once, perhaps blue, but the sun and lie had stolen its memory. The fabric clung to her frame, revealing the architecture of ribs beneath. Her hair, once blonde, now fell in dull tangles past her shoulders. The boy Owen, she had called him, clutched a dented tin pail in one hand and a threadbare blanket in the other. His eyes were too large for his face, round with a kind of hunger that went beyond the belly. "Please," Grace said, her voice thin as creek ice in March. "Please take me as your worker. I'm strong." Tokala studied her hands. They were red-knuckled, calloused at the base of each finger. Strong hands once, perhaps, but now they trembled. "You came a long way to ask," he said, his English careful, each word chosen like a stone for a cairn. "Our well turned brackish 3 weeks past," she said. "Ever since that dam went up. I can tan hides. I can mend gear, cook what you bring. Owen can haul and stack." Her voice cracked. "Just don't let us starve." Tokala glanced at the boy. Owen's gaze was steady despite the fear that flickered behind it. The warrior nodded slowly. "Work, not charity. But I won't leave you hungry." A rifle shot cracked from somewhere near the creek, the report rolling through the valley like distant thunder. Grace flinched, pulling Owen against her side. The shot had come from the direction of the dam, a mile upstream, where the creek ran wide and shallow. A warning shot. Someone ensuring no one tampered with the logs and iron that choked Wolf Creek. "Sit," Tokala said, gesturing to the log. "We'll talk terms." As Owen approached, his bare foot caught a splinter from the rough-hewn timber. He gasped, stumbling. Tokala reached out instinctively, steadying the boy, and felt the jagged wood pierce his own palm. A thin line of blood welled up bright against his brown skin. He pulled the splinter free without comment, wiping the blood on his legging. Small vulnerabilities, he thought. Even warriors bled. Another shot rang out closer this time. The bullet struck the fence post 10 feet away, with a sharp thwack sending up a spray of pale wood chips. Tokala moved faster than thought, his body a shield, as he swept Grace and Owen behind the cabin wall. His hand found the handle of his knife eyes, scanning the tree line. There, a shadow moving through the ponderosa pines, a figure on horseback retreating at a gallop. The rider vanished into the timber, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the smell of gun smoke drifting on the breeze. Grace pressed her back against the cabin wall, one arm around Owen, the other clutching her skirt. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Tokala kept his gaze on the trees until the last sound faded. Then he turned to her. "You'll work," he said. "But first you'll learn to stay alive." Timber Fork Valley stretched between the open prairie to the east and the pine-dark ridges to the west, a fertile crease of land watered by Wolf Creek. The creek ran cold and clear from mountain snowmelt, cutting through stands of cottonwood and willow, spreading into shallow pools where trout flashed silver in the sun. It had sustained 36 homesteads for a decade, each family holding 160 acres under the Homestead Act, planting wheat and oats, raising chickens and hogs, drawing water from the creek or wells fed by its aquifer. Then Percival Trent arrived. He purchased a failed cattle ranch near Buffalo Crossing, a crossroads town with a saloon, a dry goods store, a telegraph office, and a whitewashed church that doubled as the schoolhouse. The ranch sat upstream of every homestead, where the creek flowed wide and sluggish through a natural narrows. Within a month, Trent had hired laborers to construct a crib dam logs, notched and stacked secured with iron dogs, driven deep into the timber, backed by heaped stone and clay. The dam rose 8 feet high, broad as a wagon across. It held back the creek, creating a pond behind it, while reducing the downstream flow to a trickle. Trent's foreman, Crooked Miles Tabor, so named for the broken nose that bent his face into a permanent sneer, began collecting water dues from anyone who wanted access. $1 per week per household, paid in cash or goods. Those who refused found their ditches filled with stones overnight, their fences cut, their livestock spooked into the hills. Sheriff Horatio Bell, a man with thinning hair and a gut that strained his vest buttons, did nothing. Everyone knew Bell owed Trent for gambling debts that had started small but grown monstrous over the past year. What the settlers did not know was the true nature of those debts. Bell had not lost at cards. He had lost in a business venture, a silent partnership in Trent's mining operation, an investment that had gone sour when federal inspectors nearly discovered the illegal extraction. Bell had borrowed heavily to cover his share of the bribes, and now Trent held the notes. The sheriff was not merely corrupt. He was owned. Tocala had come to Timber Fork 2 years earlier, after the treaties had confined his people to reservations far to the north. He had fought in the wars against the Crow, a scar across his ribs proving it, but when the council signed away, the land he chose exile over captivity. What haunted him most was not the loss of the hunting grounds or the sacred places, but the manner of the theft. A Denver mining consortium, faceless men in eastern suits, had bribed territorial officials to redraw reservation boundaries, seizing mineral-rich land that had belonged to the Lakota for generations. Tocala's uncle, a respected elder, had protested and been found dead in a ravine, his death ruled accidental. Tocala knew better. He had seen the consortium's hired guns in the area. He had seen the fear in the officials' eyes when pressed, but he had been powerless to stop it. He guided freight wagons over Granite Pass, now a steep route through the mountains to the mining camps beyond. He lived alone in a cabin on the valley's western edge, built from lodgepole pine and chinked with clay. He owned a Henry rifle, a knife with a bone handle, and the clothes on his back. He had no interest in the settlers' quarrels over water rights and land deeds. He wanted only to be left alone to carve out a small measure of peace in a world that had taken everything from him. But alone was not safe for Grace Ashford and her son. Grace's husband Adam had died 2 months prior, drowned in Wolf Creek under circumstances the sheriff called accidental. Adam had been a wheelwright, a man who could turn a spoke or repair an axle faster than any blacksmith in the valley. He had spoken out against the dam, arguing before a town meeting that Trent had no legal right to block a navigable waterway. 3 days after that meeting, Adam's body washed up on a gravel bar, his skull cracked, his pockets empty. No one investigated. No one dared. What Grace did not know, what no one yet knew, was that Adam had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than water theft. The old silver mine near Trent's ranch, abandoned since the Mexican-American War, had been quietly reopened. Trent needed water, not just to control the homesteaders, but to operate the sluices and stamp mills hidden in the canyon behind his property. Silver ore was being extracted illegally from federal land, refined and shipped east under false manifests. Adam had discovered the operation while repairing a wagon axle for one of Trent's miners. He had seen the ore, the equipment, the armed guards. That knowledge had killed him. Grace had tried to work Adam's trade, but the settlers would not hire a woman for such labor. She had tried to farm their 20 acres, but without water, the wheat died. The well, which had always been sweet, turned brackish foul with minerals and undrinkable. She had sold the chickens, the plow, the last of Adam's tools. Now she had only Owen, age 9, and desperation. When she appeared at Tocala's cabin that evening, it was not romance that drove her, but survival. She could tan hides, a skill learned from her mother. She could mend leather harnesses and stitch canvas. She could cook venison stew over an open fire and bake cornbread in a Dutch oven. In exchange, Tokala would share his water, his labor, his protection. Half her work would go to feeding herself and Owen. The other half would pay for repairs to his cabin, the leather work on his saddle, the mending of his moccasins. Tokala agreed because he needed help. Guiding freight was grueling work, and his gear wore out faster than he could repair it. He had no wife, no family. Hiring her was practical. Nothing more. The first day, Grace washed the cabin's plank floor while Owen carried firewood. Tokala felled a dead ponderosa behind the cabin, limbing it with an axe. The work was hot, the August sun pressing down like a weight. Midday, Owen brought water from the creek in the tin pail. Tokala drank, then handed the dipper to Grace. Their fingers brushed hers, rough and work-worn, his scarred across the knuckles. She looked away quickly, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. As they worked, Tokala noticed something odd. Among the tools Grace had brought in a canvas sack was a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with initials PT. He said nothing, filing the observation away. Perhaps it had been Adams purchased second-hand. Or perhaps there was another explanation. That evening, as the sun bled red behind the ridges, danger came. Tokala was splitting kindling when he heard the rustling in the underbrush. He straightened, axe in hand, and saw the black bear emerge from the willows. It was a young boar, maybe 300 pounds, its muzzle dusted with gray. Bears were common in late summer foraging before the first frost. This one had smelled the remains of a deer carcass Tokala had butchered that morning, the bones and hide discarded in a ravine 50 yards downslope. The bear stood on its hind legs, sniffing the air. Grace, who had been hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees, froze. Owen, beside her, clutched her skirt. "Do not run," Tokala said quietly, not taking his eyes off the bear. "Make noise. Be large." Grace shouted, her voice shrill and fierce. Owen banged the tin pail against the side of the cabin. Tokala raised the axe over his head, stepping forward, his voice a low growl of Lakota words. The bear dropped to all fours, huffing, uncertain. It swung its head side to side, then turned and lumbered back into the brush. Grace exhaled, her knees buckling slightly. She reached out, steadying herself against the cabin wall. Her fingers grazed Tokala's forearm, not his sleeve, but skin, just for a moment. The contact was brief, electric, a spark of trust passing between them. He nodded once, saying nothing. Words were unnecessary. They had stood together against the danger. That was enough. But as night fell and Tokala stoked the hearth, he found himself watching Grace as she settled Owen on his pallet. There was a quiet strength in her movements, a resilience born of loss. And though he told himself this was merely a business arrangement, he could not deny the faint stirring of something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that survival was easier when shared. Owen woke before dawn, slipping from the pallet where he slept beside his mother. He had been following Tokala's patrols for 3 mornings, now curious about the warrior's habits. Tokala rose early, walked the perimeter of the property, checked the tree line for tracks, then returned to sharpen his knife or oil his rifle. Owen admired the routine, the discipline. He wanted to learn it. This morning, instead of following Owen, headed upstream toward the dam. He had overheard Tokala and his mother speaking in low tones the night before, words about Adam's death, about the creek, about danger. He wanted to see the dam for himself, to understand what his father had died for. The sky was pale gray when Owen reached the narrows. The dam loomed ahead, a brutal architecture of timber and iron logs, slick with moss, the pond behind it, dark and still. The air smelled of rot and stagnant water. Owen crept closer, staying low behind the willows. A guard sat on a log near the dam's base, a rifle across his knees, his hat pulled low. The man was snoring. Owen's foot slipped on the wet stones. His hand shot out to catch himself, and he felt something wedged between the rocks, a knife. He pulled it free. The blade was rusted, the wooden handle swollen from moisture, but there was something scratched into it. The initials A.R., Adam Rourke. His father's knife. Owen's heart hammered. He turned the knife over, seeing dried blood in the joint where blade met handle. His breath came fast. He pocketed the knife and began to back away. The guard stirred, lifting his head. His eyes opened, locking onto Owen. "Hey!" he shouted, fumbling for his rifle. Owen ran. The rifle cracked behind him, the bullet snapping through the cottonwood branches overhead. He sprinted through the willows, his bare feet pounding the mud, lungs burning. Another shot. He dove behind a deadfall, pressed himself flat, then crawled through the cattails until he reached the cover of the timber. Only then did he risk a glance back. The guard was standing at the dam's edge, scanning the brush, but he did not pursue. Owen ran all the way home. Takala met him at the cabin door. "Where were you?" Owen held out the knife, his hands shaking. Grace, emerging from inside, saw it and went pale. She sank onto the bench, covering her mouth. "That's Adam's," she whispered. Takala took the knife, examining it in the morning light. The initials were clear. The blood was real. He looked at Grace. "You said he drowned." "That's what they told me." Takala's jaw tightened. Knives don't end up in creeks by accident. A voice called from the yard. "Mind if I approach?" Takala turned. A man on a mule was riding up the path, a tall, lean figure with red hair and a physician's satchel slung over his shoulder. Dr. Seamus O'Rourke, Adam's older brother. He had arrived in Timber Fork a week after Adam's death, asking questions no one would answer. He had stayed opening a small surgery in a rented room above the dry goods store, treating settlers for fever and broken bones, all the while searching for the truth. Seamus dismounted, his gaze falling on the knife in Takala's hand. His expression hardened. "Where did you find that?" "The dam," Owen said. "Wedged in the rocks." Seamus took the knife, turning it over. "I suspected foul play. Now I know." Grace stood, her voice unsteady. Seamus Adam never carried that knife to the creek. He left it in his workshop. "Then someone brought it there," Seamus said. "Someone who wanted to make sure it was never found." He looked at Takala. "Adam sent me something before he died. A ledger. He told me to keep it safe, that if anything happened to him, it would prove what Trent was doing." "Show us," Takala said. Seamus led them inside. He knelt by the cabin's loose floorboard, the one Adam had installed himself, and pried it up. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger. He opened it to reveal columns of names, dates, amounts paid. Beside each entry was a notation: water dues, ditch repair, fence mending. At the back, a separate page showed a deed transfer, creek rights, briefly assigned to Adam Rourke, then scratched out with heavy ink strokes. Grace's hands trembled as she touched the page. Takala steadied them with his own, his fingers warm and rough. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. This was evidence. This was danger. This was the fight Adam had died for. But there was more. Tucked into the ledger's back pages was a folded map, hand-drawn, showing the canyon behind Trent's ranch. Marked on it were the locations of stamp mills, ore wagons, and armed patrols. At the top, in Adam's handwriting, were the words: "Silver Mine Illegal Operation, Federal Land. Consortium Contract, Denver Mineral Syndicate." Seamus's face went white. "By thunder," he breathed. "Trent's not just stealing water, he's stealing silver." Takala's blood ran cold. Denver Mineral Syndicate. He knew that name. It was the same consortium that had bribed officials to seize Lakota land 2 years ago. the same consortium responsible for his uncle's death. His hands clenched around the ledger, knuckles white. Grace noticed. "Tokala, what is it?" He forced himself to breathe. "That consortium. They took my people's land, bribed the territorial government to redraw the reservation boundaries. My uncle protested. They killed him and called it an accident." His voice was low-controlled, but the fury beneath was palpable. "If Trent is working with them, this is bigger than water theft. This is a pattern. They steal, they kill, and they move on." Seamus met his gaze. "Then we stop them here." Outside, hoofbeats approached. Tokala moved to the window. 6 riders circled the cabin, rifles drawn. Crooked Miles Tabor sat at their head, his broken nose a jagged shadow across his face. "Touch the dam," Miles called, his voice carrying across the yard, "and we collect bones." Tokala stood in the doorway, his Henry rifle in hand, his body a wall between the riders and the people inside. He said nothing. He did not need to. The message was clear: try us and see. Miles spat into the dirt, turned his horse, and rode away. But the threat lingered heavy as the dust they left behind. To save the valley, they needed to reach the territorial magistrate. The ledger was proof of extortion, fraud, and possibly murder, but it was worthless if it never left Timber Fork. The nearest magistrate's office was in Fort Kearney, 3 days' ride east. Tokala suggested they wire ahead, requesting an immediate investigation. The telegraph office in Buffalo Crossing could send the message within the hour. Grace, Tokala, Seamus, and schoolteacher Victoria Hale, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had lost her own farm to Trent's schemes and now taught children in the church, set out at midday. Victoria carried the ledger in a satchel, wrapped again in oilcloth. Owen stayed behind with neighbors, safer than on the trail. Buffalo Crossing baked under the August sun, the dirt street empty, save for a mangy dog sleeping in the shade of the saloon. The telegraph office stood beside the livery, a narrow building with a single window and a hand-painted sign. Inside the operator, a thin man named Silas Trent Percival's cousin sat at the key, tapping out a message for a cattle buyer. "Need to send a wire to Fort Kearney," Seamus said, sliding $1 across the counter. Silas glanced at the money, then at the group. His gaze lingered on Tokala. "Line's down. Storm last night took out a pole somewhere past Willow Bend." "That's 15 miles west," Victoria said. "We need to send east." "Still down." Seamus leaned forward. "The line runs on separate poles. A break to the west wouldn't affect the eastern route." Silas's jaw tightened. "I said it's down." Tokala's hand moved to the hilt of his knife. "You're lying." Silas stood, reaching beneath the counter. Before he could pull the pistol hidden there, Tokala slammed his palm on the countertop, pinning Silas's wrist. "Step back." Tokala said, his voice low and cold. Seamus grabbed the ledger. "We're leaving." They hurried outside, but the street was no longer empty. 6 men stood waiting, rifles leveled. At their head was Quick Quinn, a gaunt drifter with pale eyes and a reputation for never missing a shot. Beside him, Crooked Miles sat astride his horse, grinning. "Ledger," Miles said. "Hand it over." "Not today," Victoria replied, clutching the satchel. Quinn raised his rifle. Tokala shoved Grace and Victoria behind the nearest wagon, a freight hauler loaded with sacks of flour. The first shot splintered the wagon's sideboards. Flour burst from one sack, a white cloud billowing into the air. Seamus hurled a handful of embers from the telegraph office's stove, scattering them into the street. One of the men yelped, batting at his coat. Victoria swung her broom, she had grabbed it from the livery, and tripped another man as he charged. Tokala grabbed a crate lid, using it to deflect Quinn's second shot, then drove his shoulder into Quinn's ribs. The rifle clattered to the ground. "Run!" Seamus shouted. They fled down the alley between the telegraph office and the livery, scrambling over a fence cutting through the backyard of the church. Quinn's men followed, but the group had a head start. They reached the edge of town and plunged into Owl Canyon, a narrow gorge carved by a seasonal creek, its walls steep and jagged. The descent was treacherous. Loose shale slid beneath their boots, threatening to pitch them over the edge. Takala led, finding handholds in the rock, testing each ledge before stepping. Grace came next, her skirt torn and bloodied from catching on thorns. Victoria followed then, Seamus. Behind them, gunfire echoed, bullets ricocheting off stone. Grace's foot slipped on loose shale, and she cried out, grabbing for a root. Takala caught her wrist, his grip iron hard. For a moment, they were pressed together, in the narrow crevice, her body against his, her breath warm on his neck. He could feel her heartbeat, frantic and strong. No apologies, no words, just the necessary closeness of survival. And beneath it, something neither would name, yet a pull, a recognition, a bond forming in the crucible of shared danger. They reached the canyon floor as dusk fell, stumbling into the cover of juniper and sage. The pursuit had stopped. Quinn's men were city toughs, not trackers. They would not follow into the wilderness at night. Takala led them west to the shack of faithful Fred Wilcox, a farmer who lived alone on the valley's edge. Fred was waiting with a lantern when they arrived, his weathered face grim. "Heard the shooting," Fred said. "Figured you'd need a place to lay low." Fred's shack was a single room with a dirt floor, a stone hearth, and a roof patched with tar paper. He had lived here for 8 years, farming 20 acres of wheat and keeping a cow. Trent's men had sabotaged his irrigation ditch twice, forcing him to haul water by hand. He paid the water dues when he could, went without when he could not. He was too old and too stubborn to leave. "You're fighting a losing war," Fred said, pouring coffee from a dented pot. "Trent owns the sheriff, the telegraph, half the town. What do you have?" "Evidence," Seamus said, opening the ledger. Fred studied the pages, his lips moving as he read. "Double payments, threats, sabotage." He tapped a notation beside his own name. "This is accurate. I paid twice in June because Miles claimed I'd shorted him the first time." Victoria leaned forward. "If we can gather sworn statements from others, we can build a case even without the telegraph." "And how do you propose to keep breathing long enough to do that?" Fred asked. Takala stood by the window, watching the darkness. "We protect the evidence, and we protect each other." For the next 3 nights, they worked in shifts. Takala and Grace patrolled the ditches, watching for saboteurs. Twice they encountered men with shovels and torches, intent on filling the ditches with stones. The first time, Takala fired a warning shot and the men fled. The second time, he and Grace charged them with clubs lengths of hickory Fred had cut for fence posts. The men scattered, one dropping his torch in the dirt. On the third night, Owen appeared carrying a lantern. He had sneaked away from the neighbors, determined to help. As he hurried through the willows, his foot caught a snare, a length of barbed wire strung low between 2 stakes, meant to trip a horse or a man. Owen cried out, falling. Takala reached him first, seeing the wire tangled around the boy's ankle. He grabbed the barbs with his bare hands, pulling them free, the metal cutting deep into his palm and forearm. Blood flowed dark and steady. Grace arrived seconds later, her face white. She tore strips from the hem of her skirt, binding Takala's arm. Her hands shook, but she did not falter. Her eyes met his steady despite the fear. "You saved him," she whispered. "He's worth saving," Takala replied. As she wrapped the makeshift bandage, her knuckles brushed the inside of his wrist, lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The contact sent a jolt through him. Not desire, not yet, but something deeper. recognition, partnership, the beginning of trust forged in shared danger. During the days, Victoria traveled from farm to farm, distributing barrels of creek water to families in need. Children had begun falling ill, fevers, stomach cramps, vomiting. Seamus examined several and suspected poisoning from runoff. Trent's ranch sat near the site of an old silver mine, abandoned after the Mexican-American War. But as Seamus investigated further, he discovered the mine was no longer abandoned. Fresh excavations scarred the hillside, hidden behind a screen of timber. Ore wagons rolled out at night, their cargo covered with canvas tarps. The tailings crushed rock and chemical residue from the refining process had leached into the creek, especially in the stagnant pond behind the dam. The water was not just scarce, it was tainted. Seamus brought his findings to Tokala. If we don't break that dam soon, children will die. Tokala nodded. Then we move faster. They needed more than evidence. They needed proof of murder. That meant confronting Zakhar Kovalenko, the millwright who had built the dam. Zakhar lived in Buffalo Crossing, above the livery, keeping to himself. He was a Russian immigrant, broad-shouldered and silent, skilled with timber and iron. But there were rumors, whispers, that he had witnessed something terrible and kept silent out of fear. Tokala and Seamus found him drinking alone in the saloon one evening. They sat at his table uninvited. Zakhar eyed them warily, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. "We know you built the dam," Tokala said. "I build what I'm paid to build." "Did Trent pay you to kill Adam Rourke?" Zakhar's expression did not change, but his hand stilled. "I didn't kill anyone." "But you know who did." Zakhar looked around the saloon. The bartender was at the far end, polishing glasses. Two cowhands played cards in the corner. No one was listening. Zakhar leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "If I talk, Trent will kill me." "If you don't," Seamus said, "the law will hang you as an accomplice." Zakhar drank the last of his whiskey. "Meet me at Granite Pass. Tomorrow at dawn. I'll bring what you need." The next morning, Tokala, Grace, and Seamus rode to Granite Pass, a steep trail winding through boulders and scrub pine. Zakhar waited beneath a tarp, strung between two rocks sheltering from the sun. Beside him lay a small wooden box. "Adam's deed," Zakhar said, opening the box. Inside was a sheaf of papers, the original unsigned deed transferring partial creek rights to Adam, and a promissory note from Trent offering $200 for temporary creek guardianship, signed by Trent and witnessed by Zakhar. "Temporary," Grace said. "Trent promised Adam he'd restore full flow after the pond filled," Zakhar said. "But when Adam saw the tailings leaching into the water, he demanded the dam come down. Trent refused. They argued. Adam said he'd go to the magistrate." Zakhar's voice dropped. 3 days later, Miles drowned him at the dam. I watched. I was too afraid to stop it. Tokala's hand moved to his knife. "You watched a man die." "I'm not a killer," Zakhar said. "But I'm not brave either. I hid these papers because I thought one day they might keep me alive." Seamus took the papers. "They will, if you testify." Zakhar nodded, his face pale. Hoofbeats sounded on the trail below. Tokala moved to the edge, peering down. 6 riders led by Crooked Miles. They had been followed. "Move!" Tokala shouted. The group scrambled up the slope, Zakhar limping behind. The riders spurred their horses, closing fast. The trail switchbacked twice, narrow and treacherous. At the first turn, Tokala hooked a rider's stirrup with a pick he had carried for the ascent, yanking the man from his saddle. The rider tumbled, crashing into the rocks below. At the second turn, Grace hurled a pot of hot pitch she had heated that morning for waterproofing canvas. It struck a horse's flank, and the animal reared, throwing its rider over the edge. The man's scream echoed, then cut off abruptly. Miles fired the bullet, grazing Zakar's leg. Zakar stumbled, crying out. Seamus grabbed him, half dragging him into the shelter of a boulder field. Takala laid down covering fire with his Henry each shot precise, forcing the riders to take cover. The group retreated higher until the trail became too steep for horses. Miles and his men dismounted, but by then Tokala had led the group into a storm cave, a hollow in the rock, where runoff had carved a shelter. They huddled inside, breathing hard. Tokala's forearm throbbed, the bandage soaked through. Grace knelt beside him, unwrapping the cloth. The cuts were deep, angry red. She cleaned them with whiskey from Seamus's flask, her movements gentle but efficient. As she rewrapped the wound, she paused, her voice barely audible. Why are you helping us? You could leave. Guide freight somewhere safer. Takala was silent for a moment, watching the firelight flicker across the cave walls. Then he spoke, his voice low. 2 years ago, a consortium from Denver stole land from my people. They bribed officials, moved boundaries, took what was sacred. My uncle spoke against them. They killed him, made it look like an accident. He met her eyes. That same consortium is backing Trent. I saw their name in Adam's ledger. This is not just about your valley. It is about stopping them before they do to others what they did to us. Grace's breath caught. So this is personal for you? It is, he admitted. But it is also right. Your fight and mine, they are the same. She placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. Then we fight together. Outside, the riders waited, but they could not stay forever. As the sun set, they retreated, leaving threats shouted into the wind. Takala watched them go, his breath steadying. Beside him, Grace sat close, their bodies pressed together for warmth in the cooling air. The rain began then, a sudden downpour drumming on the rocks outside the cave entrance. In the enclosed space, with the firelight flickering and the sound of rain creating a cocoon of isolation, Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm afraid, she whispered. So am I, he admitted. Fear is honest. It means we understand what we stand to lose. She lifted her head, looking at him in the dim light. What do you stand to lose? He hesitated, then answered with a truth that surprised even himself. This, you, Owen. The chance to stop running and belong somewhere. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. Instead, she reached up and traced the scar across his ribs, visible through the tear in his tunic. We've both lost so much already. Maybe we can hold on to what's left. Together. He covered her hand with his, their fingers intertwining. No words were needed. They had survived together again. And in that moment, they both understood that survival was no longer the only thing binding them. Back at Fred's shack, Grace pored over the ledger by lamplight. Seamus had noted discrepancies in Trent's payments, certain entries marked with codes like ZK12 or ZK18. Grace traced the letters with her finger. ZK, she said. Zakar Kovalenko. Takala leaned over her shoulder. The millwright. Grace turned the page, finding a notation beside Adam's name. Deed unsigned, ZK witness required. She looked up at Tokala. Zakar wasn't just a witness. He was Trent's middleman. Seamus flipped to the promissory note they had recovered at Granite Pass. Trent promised Adam $200 for temporary guardianship. But guardianship of what Adam didn't own, the creek. He was supposed to, Grace said. Trent was going to transfer partial rights to Adam to appease the homesteaders. Make it look like a local man controlled the water. But Adam never signed. Takala's jaw tightened. because he realized it was a lie. Grace's hands trembled as she deciphered another code, a ZK murder risk. She looked at Zakar, who sat by the hearth, his leg bandaged. "You knew Trent planned to kill Adam." Zakar met her gaze, his expression hollow. "I knew after the argument. Trent told Miles to handle it. I didn't think he meant..." He trailed off. "You watched him die," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I watched," Zakar admitted. "Miles held him under. I stood on the bank. I wanted to stop it, but I froze. Afterward, I hid the papers. I thought if Trent came for me, I'd have proof to bargain with." Seamus stood, his fists clenched. "You let my brother drown to save your own skin." "I'm not a brave man," Zakar said. "But I'm here now. I'll testify. I'll tell the magistrate everything." Takala looked at Grace. Her eyes were wet, but her face was hard. "Will that bring Adam back?" "No," Takala said. "But it might stop Trent from killing anyone else." Before they could say more, Victoria burst through the door, her face flushed. "I found something." She held up a document she had taken from the church records, a copy of the deed to Trent's ranch. "Look at the date. Trent purchased the property 3 months before Adam died. But here's the twist: the deed includes mineral rights to the canyon behind the ranch. That silver mine isn't on federal land. It's on Trent's land. He's mining legally." Seamus frowned. "Then why the secrecy?" Victoria pointed to a clause in fine print. "Because the deed stipulates that any mining operation must not interfere with downstream water access. If the homesteaders can prove the dam is part of the mining operation, not just water control, Trent's mining rights are void. The land reverts to federal ownership." Takala understood immediately. The dam isn't just about water dues. It's about hiding the mine. "And the tailings," Seamus added. "If word gets out that Trent's mine is poisoning the creek, the federal government will shut him down and seize the property. He'll lose everything." Grace's hands shook as she set down the ledger. Adam must have figured this out. That's why Trent killed him. But there was more. As Grace reached for the small leather journal in her satchel, the one she had been hiding, Tokala's hand shot out, stopping her. "What is that?" Grace hesitated, then pulled the journal free. The initials PT gleamed in the lamplight. "I took it from Adam's workshop the day he died. I didn't know what it was. I was afraid to look." Takala opened the journal. Inside were sketches, detailed diagrams of the dam, the mine, the ore wagons. And on the last page, a note in Adam's handwriting. "Grace, if you're reading this, I'm dead. Trent knows. He has someone inside. Trust no one. The consortium is bigger than Trent. They're everywhere. Bell is one of them." The room went silent. "Bell," Victoria whispered. "The sheriff," Seamus's face darkened. "Bell's gambling debts. We thought Trent owned him through cards. But what if it was never gambling? What if Bell was a partner in the mine from the start?" Takala felt the pieces falling into place. A silent partner. Someone who could provide legal cover, deflect investigations, ensure the operation stayed hidden. Grace looked at Zakar. "Did you know about Bell?" Zakar nodded slowly. "I built the dam. But I also built structures for the mine support beams or chutes. Bell came to inspect twice. He wasn't there as a lawman. He was there as an investor. He and Trent argued once about profit shares. Bell wanted more. Trent told him to be patient, that once the valley was secured and the operation fully scaled, there'd be enough for everyone." "Everyone," Takala said bitterly. "Meaning the consortium. The same men who stole from my people are here stealing from yours. Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats filled the yard. Miles and his men surrounded the shack, torches blazing. One rider hurled a torch onto the tar paper roof. Flames licked upward. "Out!" Tokala shouted. They burst through the door, Tokala firing as they ran. Grace reloaded his Henry with practiced speed, her movements swift and sure. They retreated into the willows, the shack burning behind them. Fred tried to save his cow, cutting the rope that tethered her. A bullet struck him in the chest. He fell clutching the wound, his breath rattling. Grace knelt beside him, pressing her hands to the blood. But it was too much. Fred's eyes glazed. His last words were a whisper, "Don't let them win." Miles and his men did not pursue into the darkness. They had made their point. Tokala carried Fred's body to the creek, wrapping it in a blanket. Seamus said a prayer, though neither Grace nor Tokala prayed. They buried him at dawn, marking the grave with a cairn of stones. Grace stood over the grave, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "This is my fault. I brought you into this." Tokala's voice was firm. "If I go, they still come. For you, for Owen, for anyone who stands against them. We finish this together." That night, as rain drummed on the canvas shelter they had strung between two trees, Grace sat beside Tokala. She held a stone warmed at the hearth, pressing it gently to his temple, where a rock had grazed him during the escape. They sat close, the cold rain, a curtain around them, their combined warmth the only comfort. No grand declarations, just the quiet commitment of two people who had chosen to face the darkness together. But as Tokala closed his eyes, one question gnawed at him. If Bell was part of the conspiracy, how deep did the corruption run? Trent, sensing the net tightening, called a town meeting in the church. Half the valley attended, drawn by fear and hunger. Sheriff Bell stood at the front, his badge gleaming, his voice carrying over the crowd. "There's been talk," Bell said, "of troublemakers stirring unrest. Outsiders who don't understand how things work here." His gaze found Tokala standing at the back with Grace and Seamus. "We've issued warrants for the arrest of the Lakota known as Tokala and Dr. Seamus O'Rourke on charges of trespassing, theft, and incitement to riot." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some settlers looked away ashamed. Others nodded, their fear of Trent outweighing their sense of justice. Victoria stood, her voice ringing out. "Those are false charges. Trent is extorting this valley. He killed Adam Rourke to keep him quiet. We have proof." Proof. Trent rose from his seat, his expression calm, his suit immaculate despite the heat. "Show me." Seamus held up the ledger. "This records every illegal payment you've collected, every ditch you've sabotaged, every threat your men made." Trent smiled. "That's a personal record of legitimate business transactions. Water infrastructure costs money. I'm simply recovering expenses." "And Adam's deed?" Seamus demanded. "A draft, never finalized. Adam changed his mind." "Because you tried to defraud him," Victoria said. Trent's smile faded. "Careful, Miss Hale. Slander is actionable." The crowd shifted uneasily. Tokala saw the fear in their faces, the fear of losing what little they had. Trent controlled the water, the law, the future. What could one ledger do against that? Victoria stepped forward. "If you're so confident, Mr. Trent, why not let the territorial magistrate review the evidence?" Trent's eyes narrowed. "Because the magistrate is 3 days away, and by the time he arrives, this so-called evidence will have disappeared, along with anyone foolish enough to believe it." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some families sided with Tokala, gathering at Victoria's schoolyard to plan resistance. Others sided with Trent, fearing retribution. That night, Trent's men rode through the valley, delivering warnings. At Victoria's schoolyard, a group of roughs threw stones. One struck Victoria in the shoulder, knocking her down. Tokala shielded her with his body, taking a blow to the temple that split the skin. Blood ran down his face as he ushered her to safety. The raid came after midnight. A dozen riders surrounded a rebuilt shelter where 3 families had taken refuge. They drove off the livestock, torched the shed. One man, trying to cut his cow free from a burning post, was shot in the back. He died as his wife screamed, her cries echoing across the valley. Grace, watching from the tree line with Tokala, felt something break inside her. "We can't win," she whispered. "We can," Tokala said, "but not alone." She turned to him, tears streaming. "You should leave. Take Owen and go. You don't owe us this." Tokala's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady. "If I go, they still come. For you. For him. For everyone who can't fight back. We stay. We finish it." They sat together under the dripping pines, rain soaking them both. Grace pressed the warmed stone to Tokala's temple, her fingers tracing the edge of the wound with unexpected tenderness. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers in the dim light. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the 2 of them. 2 people bound by loss, by danger, by a growing connection neither had sought, but both now depended on. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "So am I," he said. "But fear keeps us sharp. It keeps us alive." She nodded, her hand lingering on his cheek. "Then we stay sharp together." But the next morning brought a revelation that shattered their fragile hope. As Seamus reviewed Adam's journal one more time, he found a notation they had missed, a sketch of the consortium's organizational chart. At the top was a name, H. Bell, listed as Regional Coordinator. Below it, a note. Bell recruited Trent, promised mine access in exchange for water control and legal protection. Payment 30% profits. Tokala stared at the page. Bell wasn't just bought, he was an architect. Which means every move we've made he's known about. Grace said, her voice hollow. Every plan, every meeting. He's been feeding information to Trent all along. Victoria's face went pale. We have to assume he knows about the ledger, about Zakar's testimony, about everything. Then we move now, Tokala said, before he can act. But they were too late. That evening, as they prepared to leave for Fort Kearney with the evidence riders surrounded their camp. Not Miles's men this time, but federal deputy marshals, or men wearing deputy badges. Bell stepped forward, his voice booming with false authority. Tokala Seamus O'Rourke, you're under arrest for murder, arson, and conspiracy against the territorial government. Murder, Seamus shouted. We've killed no one. Fred Wilcox, Bell said smoothly, burned alive in his shack. Witnesses say you were there. You burned that shack, Grace cried. Bell smiled. Prove it. The deputies moved forward. Tokala raised his rifle, but Grace put a hand on his arm. If we fight, they'll kill us. We need another way. Tokala lowered the weapon, his mind racing. They were surrounded, outnumbered, with no legal recourse. Bell had them trapped. But as the deputies closed in, a voice rang out from the darkness. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff. Everyone turned. A figure emerged from the trees, a tall man in a long coat, a silver star pinned to his chest. Behind him were 4 genuine federal marshals, their rifles leveled. I'm Chief Marshal Theodore Grant, the man said. Fort Kearney. We received a wire 2 days ago about illegal mining and extortion in Timber Fork. Took us some time to get here, but we're here now. His gaze fixed on Bell. And from what I've been hearing, Sheriff, you've got some explaining to do. Bell's face went white. This is a misunderstanding. Save it, Grant said. He turned to Tokala. You the one who sent the wire. Tokala shook his head, confused. The telegraph office refused. Not that office, Grant said. A rider brought the message to our outpost. Said it was sent by a millwright named Zakhar Kovalenko. Detailed allegations of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. We came to investigate. Zakhar stepped forward, his face grim. I sent it 3 days ago, after Granite Pass. I knew if I didn't, we'd all be dead before the magistrate arrived. Seamus stared at him. You redeemed yourself. I'm trying, Zakhar said quietly. Grant gestured to his marshals. Arrest Bell, and someone find this Percival Trent. We've got questions for him too. But Trent was already moving. From the cover of the trees, a shot rang out, aimed not at Tokala or the marshals, but at Zakhar. The bullet struck the Russian in the shoulder, spinning him. Chaos erupted. Trent's men charged from the darkness, firing wildly. The marshals returned fire. Grace pulled Owen to the ground, shielding him. Tokala, blood roaring in his ears, raised his Henry and fired toward the muzzle flashes. In the confusion, Trent fled, dragging Bell with him. Miles and Quinn followed, covering their retreat. Tokala saw them disappearing toward Owl Canyon and the rail trestle beyond. They're heading for the trestle, he shouted. If they cross, they'll reach the mining camps. We'll never find them. Grant nodded. Go. We'll secure the area and tend to the wounded. Bring them back alive if you can. Dead if you can't. Tokala, Grace, and Seamus ran into the night, following the sound of hoofbeats toward the canyon. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was all they had. They would destroy the dam, break Trent's hold on the water, and force the magistrate's hand with Zakhar's testimony and the physical evidence of Trent's crimes. But first, they had to stop Trent and Bell from escaping. The trestle loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. It was an old structure built 20 years earlier to carry freight trains across Owl Canyon. The ties were weathered, many rotten, and whole sections of railing had fallen away. A sign at the entrance warned, "Unsafe crossing prohibited." Trent and Bell were already halfway across, moving on foot, their horses left behind. Miles and Quinn brought up the rear, covering their escape with rifles. When they saw Tokala, Grace, and Seamus approaching, they opened fire. Tokala dove behind a boulder, Grace beside him. Seamus took cover on the opposite side. Bullets whined overhead, striking sparks from the rocks. "We can't let them cross," Seamus shouted. "I know." Tokala returned fire, his shots forcing Miles and Quinn to duck behind the trestle support beams. Grace reloaded his rifle with practiced speed, her movements swift despite the fear coursing through her. "The trestle's unstable. If we can collapse it, they'll be trapped." "Or we'll be trapped," Seamus pointed out. Tokala glanced at the structure. Grace was right. Several support beams were cracked, the wood dark with rot. A well-placed shot or enough weight in the right spot might bring it down, but timing would be everything. "Cover me," he said, handing Grace the rifle. Before she could protest, he sprinted toward the trestle. Quinn fired the bullet, grazing Tokala's already wounded shoulder, reopening the injury. Pain lanced through him, but he did not stop. He reached the nearest support beam and swung his axe, borrowed from Fred's tools, into the wood. Once. Twice. The beam groaned. Miles appeared above, aiming down. Tokala rolled aside as the shot struck where he had been standing. Grace fired from cover, her bullet catching Miles in the leg. He fell cursing. Tokala swung again. The beam cracked. The trestle shuddered. "Tokala, get back!" Grace screamed. But it was too late. The beam gave way. The section of trestle beneath Tokala's feet collapsed, and he fell, catching a tie with one hand. He dangled over the abyss, the canyon floor 100 feet below the creek, a thin silver ribbon in the darkness. Grace ran forward, heedless of the gunfire. She dropped to her stomach at the edge, reaching down. "Grab my hand." His fingers closed around her wrist. She pulled, straining with everything she had. Seamus arrived, grabbing her around the waist, adding his strength to hers. Together they hauled Tokala up, dragging him onto solid ground just as another section of the trestle gave way behind them. On the far side of the gap, Trent and Belle stared back, trapped. The trestle ahead of them was intact, but the section behind them was gone. They could not retreat, and crossing to the far side would take them miles from any settlement. "It's over, Trent," Seamus shouted. "Surrender." Trent's face twisted with rage. He pulled a derringer from his coat, aiming not at Seamus, but at Belle. "This is your fault," he snarled. "You said the operation was secure. You said we'd be protected." Belle backed away, hands raised. "Percival, don't be a fool." "You're the fool," Trent spat. "You wanted to cut corners, rush the timeline. You got greedy." "I got greedy." Belle's voice rose, cracking. "You're the one who killed Adam Rourke. I told you to buy him off, not murder him." Tokala's breath caught. There it was, the admission shouted across the canyon for all to hear. "You knew," Grace said, her voice shaking. "You knew Adam was murdered, and you did nothing." Belle turned to her, his expression desperate. "I didn't know Miles would kill him. I thought Trent would pay him off, make him go away. When I heard what happened, He trailed off, then rallied. "I'm not the monster here. Trent is. The consortium is. I was just trying to make a living." "By stealing," Tokala said coldly. "By poisoning wells. By letting children sicken and die." Belle's face flushed. "I never wanted that. I was in debt. Real debt, not gambling. I owed the consortium for a mining stake that went bad. They said if I helped them here, they'd forgive the debt. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Seamus said. Trent laughed bitterly. "Spare me the sermon, Doctor. You think you're heroes, you're gnats. The consortium owns half the territory. You shut down this operation, they'll open another. They always do." "Not if we expose them," Tokala said. "Not if we make sure everyone knows what they've done." Trent raised the derringer again, this time aiming at Tokala. "Then I'll make sure you don't live to tell." The shot rang out, but it did not come from Trent's gun. Miles, wounded and furious, had crawled forward and fired at Tokala. The bullet struck Tokala in the side, just below the ribs. He staggered, falling to one knee. Blood soaked his tunic, spreading fast. Grace screamed, dropping beside him. "No, no, no." Seamus was already there, ripping open Tokala's shirt, pressing his hands to the wound. "It's bad," he said grimly. "I need to get him back to camp, now." But before they could move, the trestle groaned. The support beams on Trent's side weakened by Tokala's axe, and the earlier collapse began to give way. Trent and Belle scrambled toward the far side, but the structure was disintegrating beneath them. Belle made it across, collapsing on solid ground. Trent, heavier and slower, was not as lucky. The ties beneath his feet splintered. He lunged forward, catching the edge of the trestle with both hands, the derringer tumbling into the void. "Help me!" he screamed, his eyes wide with terror. Belle stood at the edge, staring down at him. For a long moment he did nothing. Then he turned his back. "You said it yourself, Percival. The consortium always opens another operation. They don't need you. And neither do I." He walked away. Trent's scream echoed through the canyon as his grip failed. He fell, his body tumbling end over end until it struck the rocks below with a sickening crunch. The creek, swollen from recent rains, swept his broken form away into the darkness. Miles, seeing Trent's fall, made a desperate attempt to flee. But Quinn, wounded and panicking, stumbled into him. Both men lost their balance and plunged through the gap in the trestle, their cries cut short as they vanished into the abyss. On the far side, Belle stood alone, hands on his knees, breathing hard. He looked across the gap at Tokala, Grace, and Seamus. "I'll surrender." He called his voice hoarse. "I'll testify about everything. The consortium, the murders, all of it. Just don't leave me out here." Grace looked at Tokala, who was pale and barely conscious. "We need to get him help," she said urgently. Seamus nodded. "Bell can wait. The marshals will collect him." He tore strips from his own shirt, packing Tokala's wound. "Grace, I need you to keep pressure here. Don't let up no matter what." She pressed down, her hands slick with blood. Tokala's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face. "Did we stop them?" "You stopped them," she whispered, tears streaming. "You stopped all of them. Now you have to stay with me. You hear me, stay." His hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "Trying." Seamus and Grace carried him between them, stumbling back through the darkness toward the camp. Every step was agony, every breath a battle. But they did not stop. They could not. By the time they reached the marshal's camp, dawn was breaking. Seamus laid Tokala on a blanket, working frantically to clean and stitch the wound. Grace held Tokala's hand, whispering reassurances, prayers, anything to keep him anchored. Owen appeared, his face pale. "Is he going to die?" "No," Grace said fiercely. "He's not." And against all odds, as the sun climbed higher and Seamus's skilled hands worked their magic, Tokala's breathing steadied. The bleeding slowed. He opened his eyes, looking up at Grace. "Still here," he rasped. She let out a sob of relief, pressing her forehead to his. Still here. But there was still one task left. The dam. 3 days later, when Tokala was strong enough to stand, though not without pain, he, Grace, Seamus, and a group of homesteaders returned to the dam. The marshals had secured Trent's property, arrested Bell, and were in the process of dismantling the mining operation. But the dam still stood choking the creek. They had black powder, 3 kegs provided by the marshals under Seamus's supervision. They planted the kegs at the dam's base, embedding them in the crib work, where the timbers met the stone foundation. The fuses were long, giving them time to retreat before the blast. Grace and Victoria rowed downstream, alerting the homesteaders. "Open your headgates," Victoria told them. "When the water comes, be ready. This is our one chance." At midday, under a clear sky, the group assembled at the dam. Tokala lit the fuses, his movements slow and careful. Grace stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured shoulder. "Last chance to change your mind," she said. He looked at her, then at the dam, then back at her. "No, this is right." They retreated to higher ground. The fuses burned sparks, crawling toward the powder kegs. 60 seconds. 45. 30. The dam exploded. The blast was deafening, a roar that shook the earth. Timbers flew into the air, spinning end over end, trailing smoke and debris. The pond surged forward, a wall of water and foam 10 feet high. It poured through the breach, carving a new channel, filling the old creek bed, spreading into the ditches and fields below. The homesteaders cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of relief and triumph. Children ran to the water's edge, splashing in the clean, cold flow. Women wept openly. Men embraced, pounding each other's backs. Grace turned to Tokala, her eyes shining. "We did it." "We did," he agreed, though his voice was weak. She wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting him. "Come on, you need to rest." They returned to the cabin, where Seamus changed Tokala's bandages and dosed him with willow bark tea for the pain. Owen brought fresh water from the creek, marveling at its clarity. As the sun set, Grace sat beside Tokala on the porch, a blanket draped over both their shoulders. The valley was quiet, peaceful, in a way it had not been for months. What happens now? She asked softly. We rebuild, he said. We heal. We make sure this never happens again. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I like the sound of that. He turned his head, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture so gentle it nearly broke her. So do I. 6 weeks later, as autumn painted the valley in shades of amber and crimson, and the first snow dusted the high ridges, Chief Marshal Theodore Grant returned to Timber Fork. He was accompanied by the territorial magistrate Judge Augustus Hartwell, a stern man in a black coat who reviewed the evidence with meticulous care. The trial was held in the church now serving as a makeshift courtroom. The entire valley attended. Horatio Bell, shackled and pale, stood before the judge. Zakhar Kovalenko, his shoulder healed, but his conscience still heavy, testified to everything he had witnessed and the murders, the mining operation, the conspiracy. Bell, facing the noose, chose cooperation. In a halting, shame-filled voice, he detailed the consortium's operations, naming names, revealing bank accounts, exposing the network of bribed officials and hired guns that stretched from Denver to the territorial capital. I was a fool, Bell said, his voice breaking. I thought I could control it. But the consortium, they own everything, everyone. Once you're in, you can't get out. Judge Hartwell's expression was cold. You had a choice, Sheriff. You chose greed over justice. You chose silence over truth. And because of your choices, innocent people died. He delivered the verdict swiftly. Horatio Bell was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, fraud, and corruption. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison with hard labor. In an unusual gesture, the judge provided him with a law book instead of a Bible. Perhaps, Hartwell said dryly, you'll learn something about the system you spent so long subverting. Bell accepted the book with shaking hands. Later, Seamus would learn that Bell had indeed begun to read it, and had even started helping other prisoners file appeals. It was a small redemption, but a redemption nonetheless. Zakhar Kovalenko, despite his role as Trent's middleman, was granted clemency in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony. The judge sentenced him to 2 years of community service, working as a millwright, to build the public irrigation systems. Your skills will serve this valley better than a prison cell, Hartwell ruled. But if you betray this trust, and there will be no mercy. Zakhar accepted the terms with visible relief and a solemn promise to make amends. Percival Trent was convicted posthumously of water theft, extortion, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal mining operations. His estate, considerable, built on illegal dues and silver profits, was liquidated by court order. The funds were divided among the homesteaders as compensation for damages, with additional money allocated to construct public irrigation ditches, ensuring fair water access for all. But the most significant revelation came when Victoria, sorting through Trent's papers in the magistrate's presence, uncovered a contract buried beneath layers of mining documents. It was a secret agreement between Trent and the Denver Mineral Syndicate, dated 2 weeks before Adam's death. The contract detailed a plan to transfer partial ownership of a planned creek mill to Adam Rourke, making him co-owner with Trent. The mill was designed to serve the homesteaders grinding grain and sawing timber with fair tolls shared among the community. But attached to the contract was a second document, a rider clause, that revealed the true intent. The mill was to serve as a front for the mining operation, its legitimate business, concealing the movement of silver ore and refined metal. Adam was to be the public face, the local partner, while Trent and the consortium controlled the real profits. The contract stipulated that once the valley was fully under consortium control, Adam could be phased out, and the mill repurposed entirely for mining support. Adam was never meant to be a real partner. Victoria said, her voice shaking with anger as she read the contract aloud. Trent planned to use him as a puppet, then eliminate him once the mine was fully operational and the homesteaders were placated. Grace took the documents, her hands trembling. Tokala sitting beside her, his side still bandaged, but healing red over her shoulder. Seamus leaned in, his jaw clenched. Adam must have discovered the rider clause, Seamus said. That's why he refused to sign the deed. He realized Trent was using him and the entire valley to cover an illegal operation. Judge Hartwell examined the documents carefully. This changes everything. The consortium's contract is illegal on multiple fronts: fraud, conspiracy to smuggle federal resources, and violation of land use restrictions. I'll be issuing federal warrants for the arrest of the consortium's officers. But there was one more revelation. As Tokala studied the organizational chart attached to the contract, he found a notation that made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the page, in small print, was a list of previous consortium operations. One entry read, Lakota Territory Acquisition 1851 H. Bell Coordinator. Land seizure successful. Elder opposition neutralized. Tokala's hands clenched around the paper, crumpling it. Grace saw his expression and understood immediately. Your uncle, she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. Seamus placed a hand on his shoulder. They'll pay Tokala. Every last one of them. We'll make sure of it. Judge Hartwell looked at Tokala with something approaching respect. You've given us enough evidence to dismantle the entire consortium. It will take time, but we'll see it through. On behalf of the territorial government, I apologize for what was done to your people. It doesn't undo the harm, but I hope it's a start. Tokala met his gaze. Justice delayed is not justice, but it is better than nothing. The judge nodded. Then let's make sure it's not delayed further. He turned to Grace, Tokala, Seamus, and Victoria. There's an opportunity here. The mill Adam envisioned a legitimate cooperative serving the valley can still be built. The court will allocate additional funds from Trent's seized assets to make it a reality. If you're willing to see it through. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. We will. For Adam. For everyone he tried to protect. With the magistrate's approval and funding, they formed a partnership: Grace, Tokala, Seamus, Victoria, and even Zakar, who contributed his millwright skills as part of his sentence. They built the mill at a site downstream where the creek widened and the current ran strong. They named it Rourke's Gate, in honor of Adam and his vision for a valley where neighbors worked together instead of fighting for scraps. The tolls were fair, the profits shared equally among the partners, with a portion set aside for valley improvements, bridges, school books, medical supplies. The mill ground grain, sawed timber, and became a gathering place, a symbol of what the valley could be when people chose cooperation over greed. On the day the mill officially opened, a ceremony was held. The entire valley attended. Chief Marshal Grant read a proclamation from the territorial governor, commending the homesteaders for their courage and resilience. Judge Hartwell spoke of the importance of justice and the rule of law. But it was Grace who gave the most moving speech. Standing beside the mill's great wheel with Owen on one side and Tokala on the other, she spoke of Adam. My husband was a wheelwright, she said, her voice clear despite the emotion. He believed that every wheel, no matter how small, had a purpose, that every spoke supported the whole, that when one part broke, the entire structure failed. She looked around at the gathered crowd. This valley is a wheel, and we are the spokes. Alone, we are weak. Together, we are unbreakable. Adam knew that. He died trying to protect it. And now we honor him by living it. The crowd erupted in applause. Tokala, standing beside her, felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of old grief, a dawning of new hope. That evening, as the sun set and the first stars appeared, Tokala and Grace stood alone by the creek. The water flowed clear and cold, singing over the stones. Owen was with Victoria and Seamus, learning to read by lamplight in the schoolhouse. "What do we do now?" Grace asked, echoing her question from weeks before. Tokala took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "We live. We work. We protect what we've built." She smiled, turning to face him. "That sounds like a good life." "It does," he agreed. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "Will you share it with me, not just as partners, as more?" Her breath caught. She had hoped, but not dared to assume. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said. "If you'll have me." She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we'll make it official. In front of the valley. In front of everyone." She laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I'd like that." 2 weeks later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the mill, with Seamus officiating, Victoria and Zakar standing as witnesses, and Owen holding the rings, simple bands hammered from silver, donated by a grateful homesteader. It was not a grand affair. There were no speeches, no elaborate vows. Just two people standing beside the water they had fought to free, promising to stand together through whatever came next. As winter settled over the valley, wood split and stacked stores laid in fires tended, the people of Timber Fork learned a lesson written in blood and survival: that justice, when earned through sacrifice, endures; that water, when shared freely, nourishes all; and that a bond forged in hardship is stronger than any chain forged in greed. Months passed. The snows came and went. Spring returned, bringing new growth, new hope. Tokala continued to guide freight over Granite Pass, but he always returned to the cabin in the evenings, where Grace waited with Owen and the warm glow of the hearth. They worked the land together, tended the mill, cared for the valley. And on quiet nights, when the work was done and Owen was asleep, Tokala and Grace would sit on the porch watching the stars wheel overhead, and they would talk. About the past, yes, the losses, the pain, the battles fought. But more often they talked about the future, about the life they were building spoke by spoke, day by day. One evening, as the first green shoots appeared in the fields and the creek ran high with snow melt, Owen asked, "Will Trent's men ever come back?" Tokala and Grace exchanged a glance. Then Tokala said, "The consortium is being dismantled. The marshals have arrested many of the officers. Those who remain are scattered, hunted. They will not bother us again." "But even if they did," Grace added, squeezing Owen's shoulder, "we would face them together. The valley is strong now. We've learned to stand united." Owen nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I like it here. I like our family." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "So do I, sweetheart. So do I." As the sun dipped below the ridges, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the three of them stood together at the water's edge, 3 survivors, now a family forged in firewater and blood. The creek flowed, the valley thrived, and in the quiet moments between labor and rest, they found peace. Not the fragile peace of the fortunate, but the hard-won peace of those who had fought for every breath and emerged stronger for it. The valley remembered, and it prospered.